James Stewart, An American Life on Screen, Introduction. Few actors have occupied so central a place in the American imagination as James Stewart. Across a career that stretched from the early 1930s to the early 1990s, Stewart became something like a national archetype. The earnest young idealist of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the beleaguered everyman of It's a Wonderful Life, the voyeuristic photographer of Rear Window, and the obsessive, haunted detective of Vertigo. He was, at various points in his career, the boy next door and a deeply troubled man, a folksy comedian and a war hero, a Hollywood leading man and a real-life brigadier general. What makes Stewart's career so remarkable is not simply its length or its commercial success, but its range, the way his persona evolved from open-faced innocence in the 1930s to a darker, more complicated masculinity in the postwar years, particularly in his collaborations with directors Anthony Mann and Alfred Hitchcock. This biography traces Stewart's life from his boyhood in small-town Pennsylvania through his stage apprenticeship, his rise to stardom under Frank Capra, his combat service in the Second World War, his second act as one of Hollywood's most searching dramatic actors, and his long twilight as an elder statesman of American cinema. Early life and family. James Maitland Stewart was born on May 20, 1908, in Indiana, Pennsylvania, a small town roughly 60 miles northeast of Pittsburgh. He was the eldest of 3 children, and the only son, born to Alexander Maitland Stewart and Elizabeth Ruth Jackson Stewart. The Stewart family had deep roots in Indiana, Pennsylvania. Alexander Stewart ran the J.M. Stewart and Company hardware store, a business that had been in the family for generations, and that young Jimmy, as he was known throughout his life to friends and family, was expected, at least in his father's mind, to inherit and run the store. The Stewart household was Presbyterian, disciplined, and deeply patriotic. Alexander Stewart had served in the Spanish-American War and would later serve in World War I, and he instilled in his son a strong sense of duty and civic obligation that would resurface dramatically during Stewart's own wartime service. Stewart's mother, meanwhile, was a trained pianist, and it was from her that Stewart developed his early appreciation for music. He would later become a competent accordion player, an instrument he occasionally worked into his film roles almost as a personal signature. As a boy, Stewart was fascinated by aviation, a passion that had been ignited by the exploits of World War I flying aces. He built model airplanes obsessively, and this early enthusiasm for flight would shape the course of his life far more than anyone in Indiana could have predicted, eventually leading him into a distinguished career. Mercersburg Academy and Princeton. Stewart's formal education began at local schools in Indiana, Pennsylvania, before he was sent to Mercersburg Academy, a private preparatory school in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. It was at Mercersburg that Stewart first appeared on stage, taking small roles in school theatrical productions, though at this stage acting was little more than a diversion, and nothing in his conduct suggested the ambitions of a future movie star. Academically, Stewart was an unremarkable but capable student, more drawn to science and engineering than to the humanities, and it was with an eye toward engineering that he applied to Princeton University, his father's alma mater. Stewart entered Princeton in 1928, intending to study architecture, and he would go on to earn a bachelor's degree in the subject in 1932. He was, by most accounts, a serious and diligent student, and his academic record was solid enough that he was offered a scholarship to pursue graduate studies in architecture. But it was at Princeton that Stewart's theatrical inclinations, nurtured casually at Mercersburg, began to take on a more serious cast. He joined the Princeton Triangle Club, an undergraduate theatrical organization known for its original musical productions, and he also became involved with the University Players, a summer stock theater company based in West Falmouth, Massachusetts, that would prove decisive in redirecting the course of his life. The University Players was an ambitious and unusually talented troupe of young actors, many of whom would go on to significant careers in American theater and film. It was through the University Players that Stewart met Henry Fonda, a fellow aspiring actor who would become one of his closest lifelong friends, and Margaret Sullivan, an actress with whom Stewart would work repeatedly in Hollywood and for whom he seems to have harbored a long unrequited romantic interest. Stewart's early roles with the University Players were modest. He was cast more often in small character parts than as a leading man, and there was little in his stiff, gangly presence to suggest the natural star he would become. But the theater had captured him, and upon graduating from Princeton in 1932, rather than pursuing the graduate architecture scholarship, Stewart decided to try his luck as a professional actor. Broadway and the move to Hollywood. Stewart's first professional theatrical work came through the University Players' winter operations and through small parts arranged by friends already established in New York. He made his Broadway debut in 1932 in a play called Carrie Nation, followed by small roles in a handful of other productions over the next few years, including Yellow Jack and Divided by Three. None of these represented a major breakthrough, but Stewart was building a reputation among casting directors and fellow actors as a reliable, hard-working performer with an unusual, halting speech pattern that some found awkward and others found strangely affecting. The turning point came with a 1934 play called Spring in Autumn, and more significantly with Page Miss Glory the same year, in which Stewart's performance drew enough attention that Hollywood scouts began to take notice. Universally, it was his role in the 1934 Broadway production of Divided by Three. By his side in this period was his old University Players colleague Henry Fonda, who had already made the jump to Hollywood and was urging Stewart to follow. Fonda's own early success in California gave Stewart a foothold. The two friends briefly shared a Hollywood apartment in the mid-1930s, and their friendship, sustained through decades of divergent political views, Fonda was a committed liberal, Stewart an equally committed conservative, and different career trajectories, would last until Fonda's death in 1982. In 1935, Stewart was signed to a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, then the most powerful studio in Hollywood. His early film work was undistinguished. He appeared in a string of forgettable pictures, The Murder Man, 1935, his screen debut, followed by supporting roles in films like Rosemary, 1936, and Small Town Girl, 1936, that gave him experience in front of the camera without doing much to establish him as a star. MGM did not quite know what to do with Stewart. His lanky, 6'3" frame, his diffident manner, and his distinctive drawl did not fit the conventional mold of the 1930s leading man, and for the first several years of his contract he was loaned out to other studios almost as often as he was used by MGM itself. Breakthrough and the Capra years. Stewart's fortunes changed dramatically through his association with director Frank Capra, a relationship that would define the first phase of his stardom and cement the American everyman persona for which he remains best remembered. The two men first worked together on You Can't Take It With You, 1938, an adaptation of the Pulitzer Prize-winning play, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. Stewart's performance as the idealistic son of a wealthy family, in love with a woman from an eccentric, unconventional household, showcased the qualities that would become his trademark: sincerity, warmth, and a kind of stammering earnestness that audiences found immensely appealing. It was the following year's collaboration with Capra, however, that transformed Stewart into a major star. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, cast Stewart as Jefferson Smith, a naive, idealistic leader of a boys' organization who is appointed to fill a vacant U.S. Senate seat, expecting to be a puppet for a corrupt political machine, and who instead mounts a lone filibuster against corruption on the Senate floor. The film was a sensation, and Stewart's performance, particularly the climactic filibuster sequence, in which Smith, hoarse and nearly collapsing from exhaustion, refuses to yield the floor, became one of the defining moments of 1930s American cinema. Stewart received his first Academy Award nomination for Best Actor for the role, though he lost to Robert Donat in Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Stewart followed this success with an extraordinary run of films across 1939 and 1940. He starred opposite Marlene Dietrich in the Western comedy Destry Rides Again, 1939, demonstrating an unexpected aptitude for the Western genre that would become far more significant later in his career. And in 1940, he starred alongside Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant in George Cukor's The Philadelphia Story, playing Macaulay Mike Connor, a cynical tabloid reporter who falls for Hepburn's socialite character over the course of a single eventful weekend. The performance won Stewart the Academy Award for Best Actor, an outcome that mildly surprised even Stewart himself, who reportedly believed the honor was as much a recognition of the full body of his recent work, including the widely admired Mr. Smith, as it was a judgment on The Philadelphia Story alone. By 1940, still only in his early 30s, Stewart had established himself as one of Hollywood's most bankable and critically respected stars. He seemed set for an extended run at the top of the industry. Instead, with the world sliding toward war, Stewart made a decision that would interrupt his career for nearly 5 years and that would come to define his character in the eyes of the American public as much as any role he ever played on screen. Wartime service. Stewart had held a private pilot's license since the mid-1930s, having pursued flying lessons as an extension of his boyhood fascination with aviation, and by the time of the German invasion of Poland in 1939, he had accumulated hundreds of hours of flight time, including experience with instrument flying and larger aircraft. In March 1941, months before the United States entered the war, Stewart was drafted into the Army, but he was initially rejected for being underweight for his height. Determined to serve, he reportedly worked with an MGM publicist and trainer to gain the necessary weight, and he was successfully inducted in March 1941, becoming the first major American movie star to enter the armed forces in the lead-up to the war. Stewart's celebrity initially worked against his wishes to serve in a combat capacity. The Army was reluctant to risk one of Hollywood's most famous faces in actual combat, and for the first 2 years of his military service, Stewart was largely confined to duties as a flight instructor and to appearances in training and recruitment films, assignments he found frustrating given his ambition to fly combat missions. Through persistent effort and by leveraging his considerable flight hours and qualifications, Stewart eventually secured a combat assignment, and in November 1943 he was deployed to England with the 445th Bombardment Group of the 8th Air Force, flying B-24 Liberator bombers. Stewart flew a substantial number of combat missions over Germany and occupied Europe, participating in dangerous daylight bombing raids as both a pilot and, eventually, as a squadron commander and group operations officer. He rose steadily through the ranks during his service, from second lieutenant to colonel by the war's end, one of relatively few American servicemen to advance so far in the space of a few years, and he was awarded numerous decorations including the Distinguished Flying Cross with the addition of an oak leaf cluster, the Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, and the War Cross from the French government. Stewart's superiors and fellow servicemen consistently praised his competence, coolness under pressure, and genuine leadership abilities. He was not treated as a celebrity mascot but as a serious and capable officer, a distinction that mattered enormously to Stewart himself and that he worked hard throughout his service to earn. Stewart rarely spoke publicly in detail about his combat experiences in the years immediately following the war, and by most accounts the psychological toll of his missions, which included the loss of friends and fellow airmen, stayed with him for the rest of his life. He continued his military affiliation after the war, serving in the Air Force Reserve, and he continued to rise in rank over subsequent decades, eventually attaining the rank of brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve in 1959, a distinction that made him, at the time, the highest-ranking actor in American military history. He officially retired from the Air Force Reserve in 1968, and in 1985, in recognition of his military service, he was promoted by special act of Congress from Major General, a rank he had informally been assumed to hold, with additional honors, though accounts of the precise mechanics of his later promotions vary. Even after retiring from active reserve status, Stewart continued to fly and remained deeply engaged with the Air Force community for the rest of his life. In 1966, well into middle age, he flew as a non-flying crew member on a B-52 bombing mission during the Vietnam War, a symbolic gesture that underscored his lifelong commitment to the military. Return to Hollywood and It's a Wonderful Life. Stewart returned to civilian life and to Hollywood in 1945, but the transition was neither smooth nor immediate. He was nearly 37 years old, considerably older than when he had left, and he suffered, like many combat veterans, from what would today be recognized as symptoms of post-traumatic stress. He was uncertain, by his own later account, whether he could still act at all, and he approached his return to the screen with genuine trepidation. His first post-war film, and one of the defining works of his entire career, was Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, 1946. Stewart played George Bailey, a small-town man whose lifelong dreams of travel and adventure are repeatedly sacrificed for the good of his family and community, and who, driven to the edge of suicide on Christmas Eve by a financial crisis, is shown by a guardian angel what the world would have been like had he never been born. The film was not a significant commercial success upon its initial release, and it received mixed reviews, But Stewart's performance, which required him to convey both the character's fundamental decency and, in the film's darker passages, a convincing sense of desperation and despair, was widely admired and earned him another Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Over subsequent decades, through frequent television broadcasts, particularly after the film entered the public domain in the 1970s, It's a Wonderful Life achieved the status of a beloved American holiday classic, and Stewart's performance as George Bailey came to be regarded as one of the signature achievements of his career, arguably the role with which he remains most closely identified in popular memory. The years immediately following It's a Wonderful Life were, notwithstanding the film's ultimate legacy, a period of some career uncertainty for Stewart. Now in his late 30s and early 40s, he found himself in an industry increasingly oriented toward younger leading men, and several of his immediate post-war films underperformed at the box office. It was during this period of relative uncertainty that Stewart, working with his agent Lew Wasserman, made an arrangement that would prove enormously significant not only for his own career but for the business practices of the film industry as a whole. Rather than accepting a flat salary for the 1950 Western Winchester 73, Stewart agreed to forego an upfront fee in exchange for a percentage of the film's profits. The arrangement was, at the time, a novel one for a star of Stewart's stature, and when the film became a substantial hit, it not only revitalized Stewart's career but helped establish the profit participation deal as a standard mechanism through which major stars would be compensated in subsequent decades. Winchester 73 also marked the beginning of Stewart's collaboration with director Anthony Mann, a partnership that produced a series of westerns widely regarded among the finest of the genre and that fundamentally reshaped Stewart's screen persona. Where Stewart's pre-war and immediate post-war characters had generally embodied warmth, decency, and a certain innocence, the characters he played for Mann were frequently driven by obsession, vengeance, and barely suppressed violence. Films like Winchester 73, 1950, Bend of the River, 1952, The Naked Spur, 1953, The Far Country, 1954, and The Man from Laramie, 1955, presented Stewart as a man capable of real menace and moral ambiguity, his familiar drawl and lanky physicality now put in service of characters whose composure frequently cracked to reveal rage, grief, or a near-pathological need for retribution. This darker, more psychologically complex register proved a revelation to audiences and critics who had known Stewart primarily as the wholesome hero of Capra's films, and the Mann westerns are now generally regarded as among the most important and influential examples of the psychological western, a subgenre that used the conventions of the western to explore complicated internal states rather than simple contests between good and evil. The commercial and critical success of these films did a great deal to establish Stewart, in the 1950s, as not merely a beloved star but as an actor of genuine range and depth, capable of registers well beyond the sincere everyman for which he had first become famous. The Hitchcock collaborations. Running in parallel with his westerns for Anthony Mann, Stewart embarked in the 1950s on perhaps the single most celebrated collaboration of his career, a series of films made with director Alfred Hitchcock that are today regarded among the towering achievements of American cinema. The partnership began with Rope, 1948, an experimental film shot to appear as a single continuous take, in which Stewart played a former teacher who comes to suspect that two of his former students have committed murder as an intellectual exercise. The collaboration continued more significantly with Rear Window, 1954, in which Stewart played Pound Jeffries, a photographer confined to a wheelchair by a broken leg who becomes convinced, while passing the time observing his neighbors across a Greenwich Village courtyard, that one of them has murdered his wife. The film, also starring Grace Kelly, is widely regarded as one of the finest achievements of both Stewart's and Hitchcock's careers, and Stewart's performance, largely confined to a single set and reliant on subtle shifts of expression and posture to convey Jeffrey's mounting suspicion, boredom, and voyeuristic fascination, is considered among the most disciplined and effective of his career. Stewart and Hitchcock reunited for a remake of Hitchcock's own earlier film, The Man Who Knew Too Much, 1956, in which Stewart and co-star Doris Day played an American couple whose son is kidnapped after they inadvertently become entangled in an assassination plot while traveling abroad. But it was the final and most famous of the Stewart-Hitchcock collaborations, Vertigo, 1958, that would ultimately be recognized as the artistic high point of their partnership, and by many critical assessments, of Stewart's entire career. In Vertigo, Stewart played John Scotty Ferguson, a former police detective forced into retirement by an acute fear of heights, who is hired to follow a friend's wife and becomes obsessively, destructively infatuated with her. The film's exploration of obsession, illusion, and psychological breakdown pushed Stewart into territory far removed from his earlier, more sympathetic screen persona, and his performance as a man consumed and ultimately undone by his own desires is now widely regarded as one of the most complex and unsettling performances of the classical Hollywood era. Vertigo was not a significant commercial or critical success upon its initial release. Contemporary reviews were mixed, and the film underperformed relative to expectations. It was only in subsequent decades, through critical reappraisal, that Vertigo came to be regarded as a masterpiece, and by the early 21st century it was frequently cited by critics' polls, including the well-known Sight and Sound poll, as one of the greatest films ever made, a remarkable reversal of fortune that mirrors, in some respects, the trajectory of It's a Wonderful Life from modest initial reception to eventual canonical status. Other major roles of the 1950s and 1960s. Beyond his work with Mann and Hitchcock, Stewart appeared in a number of other significant films during the 1950s and into the 1960s that further demonstrated his range. He portrayed the legendary bandleader in The Glenn Miller Story, 1954, reuniting him with June Allison, and he played baseball pitcher Monty Stratton in The Stratton Story, 1949, a role that required him to convincingly portray an athlete who continued his career after losing a leg. He also gave a notable performance in Anatomy of a Murder, 1959, directed by Otto Preminger, playing a small-town defense attorney in a legally and morally complex murder trial. The film was considered daring for its time in its frank treatment of sexual assault testimony, and Stewart's understated, procedurally grounded performance earned him another Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Stewart also worked extensively with director John Ford during this period, appearing in Two Rode Together, 1961, and, most notably, in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, 1962, in which he starred opposite John Wayne in a story about the mythologizing of the American West that is now regarded as one of the great late-career westerns of both stars. In the 1960s, Stewart also moved into lighter, more comedic family films, including a series of films for producer-director Henry Costa such as Mr. Hobbs Takes a Vacation, 1962, and Take Her, She's Mine, 1963, as well as westerns like How the West Was Won, 1962, an all-star epic that placed him alongside virtually every major western star of the era. Later career and television. As Stewart entered his 60s, his film roles became less frequent, though he continued to work steadily. He starred in the western The Shootist, 1976, alongside John Wayne, in what would prove to be Wayne's final film role, and he continued to take supporting parts and occasional leads through the 1970s and into the 1980s. Stewart also made forays into television during this period, including a short-lived situation comedy, The Jimmy Stewart Show, 1971 to 1972, and a legal drama, Hawkins, 1973 to 1974, for which he received a Golden Globe Award. Neither series achieved the sustained popularity of his film work, but both reflected Stewart's continued desire to remain professionally active even as the nature of the entertainment industry shifted around him. Stewart's final major screen credit came somewhat unexpectedly in 1991, when at the age of 83 he provided the voice of Sheriff Wiley Burp in the animated film An American Tail, Fievel Goes West, a role that introduced him to a new generation of viewers largely unfamiliar with his earlier work. It was a fitting, gentle coda to a career that had begun nearly 60 years earlier. Honors and recognition. Over the course of his career, Stewart received extensive recognition from the film industry and from the United States government alike. In addition to his competitive Academy Award for The Philadelphia Story and his multiple nominations, Stewart was awarded an honorary Academy Award in 1985 for his 50 years of memorable performances, for his high ideals both on and off the screen, with the respect and affection of his colleagues. He received the American Film Institute's Life Achievement Award in 1980, the Kennedy Center Honors in 1983, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, awarded to him by President Ronald Reagan in 1985, an honor that recognized both his contributions to American cinema and his distinguished military service. In recognition of that military service, Stewart was also awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom with reference to his role as one of the most decorated servicemen among Hollywood's ranks, and the Air Force honored him in numerous ways throughout his later life, including naming facilities after him. Personal life. Stewart maintained a reputation, unusual for a major Hollywood star, as a private and famously reticent man about his personal life, though he was linked romantically over the years with a number of prominent actresses, including Margaret Sullivan, Norma Shearer, Ginger Rogers, and Olivia de Havilland, among others. None of these relationships led to marriage. Stewart did not marry until relatively late by the standards of the era. In 1949, at the age of 41, he married Gloria Hattrick McLean, a former model and socialite who had two young sons, Ronald and Michael, from a previous marriage. Stewart formally adopted both boys, and the couple went on to have twin daughters, Judy and Kelly, born in 1951. The marriage proved to be a stable and enduring one, lasting 45 years until Gloria's death in 1994, and by most contemporary and later accounts, it was a source of considerable personal happiness and stability for Stewart throughout the middle and later decades of his life. The Stewarts suffered a profound loss in 1969, when Ronald Stewart, Stewart's adopted stepson, was killed in action while serving as a Marine in the Vietnam War. Stewart, whose own wartime service had instilled in him a deep and lasting connection to the American Armed Forces, rarely spoke publicly about his son's death, but those close to the family have suggested that the loss affected him profoundly for the remainder of his life. Politically, Stewart was a lifelong and outspoken conservative Republican, a stance that placed him in occasional friendly tension with several of his closest friends and colleagues in the famously liberal-leaning film industry, including Henry Fonda, with whom he maintained a rule of simply not discussing politics in order to preserve their friendship. Stewart was a vocal supporter of the Vietnam War and generally supported Republican political candidates throughout his life, though he was not typically regarded as a partisan firebrand and largely avoided the kind of overt political activism pursued by some of his contemporaries. Final years and death. Following the death of his wife Gloria in 1994, Stewart's own health declined considerably, and he largely withdrew from public life during his final years, reportedly suffering from depression in the wake of his wife's death. He was hospitalized on several occasions in the mid-1990s for various ailments, including a heart condition and complications related to a pacemaker. On July 2, 1997, at his home in Beverly Hills, California, James Stewart died at the age of 89 from complications following a blood clot in his lung. His death prompted an outpouring of tributes from across the film industry and from political figures, reflecting the singular place he had come to occupy in American cultural life not merely as a movie star, but as a figure who seemed, to many, to embody a certain vision of American character: modest, decent, occasionally troubled, but fundamentally honorable. Legacy. James Stewart's legacy rests on the remarkable breadth of his body of work and on the way his screen persona evolved across more than half a century of filmmaking. He is remembered, on one hand, as the embodiment of a particular strain of mid-century American idealism, thanks above all to his work with Frank Capra, the young man who takes on a corrupt Senate in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the ordinary citizen whose life turns out to have mattered immeasurably in It's a Wonderful Life. But he is equally remembered, thanks to his work with Anthony Mann and Alfred Hitchcock, as an actor capable of considerable psychological darkness, willing to explore obsession, violence, and moral compromise in ways that few of his contemporaries, similarly associated with wholesome or heroic screen images, were willing to risk. This duality, the earnest boy next door and the haunted, obsessive man of the Hitchcock and Mann pictures, is central to any understanding of why Stewart remains such an enduring and studied figure in the history of American film. Critics and film historians have long pointed to Stewart as an example of a star whose apparent simplicity as a performer concealed a formidable and disciplined craft. His seemingly natural, hesitant, conversational delivery was by numerous accounts from directors and colleagues the product of careful and deliberate technique rather than simple native charm. His profit participation arrangement for Winchester 73 also left a lasting mark on the business of Hollywood filmmaking, helping to establish a compensation model that would become standard practice for major stars in subsequent decades. Beyond his film work, Stewart's wartime military service, culminating in his rank as a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve, remains a distinctive and rarely matched chapter in the history of Hollywood celebrity, a genuine record of combat leadership that gave a particular weight and authenticity to the sense of decency and duty that so often characterized his screen roles. Taken together, his film career and his military record combined to make James Stewart, in the eyes of many Americans across several generations, not simply a gifted actor but something closer to a national symbol and embodiment, however idealized, of a certain enduring vision of American character.